Let's talk about beards. Why do ancient philosophers have them? Now, I've added this little caveat in here, ancient philosophers, because as of course you'll see, many modern philosophers, and by modern, of course, we typically mean people from the 20th century, because no one's particularly famous for being a philosopher anymore, apart from A.C. Grading, I suppose, who has very long hair, but no beard. Often don't have beards in modern times, and I think this is an issue and a problem and something we should change. Now, and which I hope to convince you by the end of this video. Now, when you think about ancient philosophers, you think about beards. See, for example, Epicurus here, he has a beard. And yes, to answer your question and concerns, why do I have a knitted Epicurus? Well, because I wanted one, and secondly, because my mother knitted it for me. No sniggering at the back, thank you. But yes, Epicurus, famous for his beard, but interestingly, he doesn't have a philosopher's beard. I mean, he is a philosopher and he has a beard, but the particular nuance in the phrase a philosopher's beard, which I think you'll find was a rejected title for J.K. Rowling's first Harry Potter book, I think would have added a certain charm. She missed out, what can we say? Philosopher's beards is a particular phrase that is actually used and exists in the ancient world. And it actually comes quite a long time after the sort of heyday of proper Greek philosophers, although interesting, that's where the inspiration for the conception of the philosopher's beard comes. So if you think about all the famous pictures, I say pictures, you know what I mean, in terms of pictures of that you might have seen of busts and so on of the famous Hellenistic and classical philosophers, they all usually have beards. Now in Greek culture this is not unusual, it was very aristocratic and you were supposed to have a beard, that's kind of what you did. Indeed, the whole conception of how when you arrive at a man arrives at maturity or becomes an adult as such is denoted by the stage at which he can grow a proper beard, which means, unfortunately, I'm sure there must have been some men who I know sort of nowadays who are considerably older than me that still can't grow a very good beard, and I think there must have been snide comments made about it, you know, wandering around the agora and that sort of thing, but that's beside the point. Greece, very famous for their beards, and they all have quite impressive beards. When we transition into the Roman period later on, there's quite a funny story told by Dio Cassius, who's a writer in, I think, the 2nd century AD, and he might be the 3rd, and he talks about how in AD 176, so we're still in the tail end of the 2nd century, Marcus Aurelius, who is an emperor and also, interestingly to note, has quite a magnificent beard in all the different busts they have of him, elected and created 4 chairs for the heads of philosophy in Athens. And now this represents the time, the 4 main schools that were in Athens. They're different, they have different philosophies, but I think his approach is to recognise that they all have something of benefit to gain. So there's the Peripatetics, the Stoics, the Aristotelians and the Platonic school. Plato and Aristotle, well, all of these, of course, are founded by people who've been dead for quite a long time by this point, but there's been a continuous tradition. So he finds these chairs, thinks nothing of it, the schools go on about their business. Then a couple of years later, the peripatetic head dies. I'll probably do a video at some point about these different philosophies, but that's not really necessary to the story as such. Anyway, the peripatetic head dies. And so they have to go, the process of electing a new one goes about, and 2 candidates go forward for the job. It's Diocles and Bagoas, both of them equally matched in philosophy in that sense of they're both very able philosophers. Diocles is quite considerably older than Bagoas, and so the assumption goes that Bagoas will get the job. I think, you know, they're looking for longevity in the post or that sort of thing, and if they, you know, it's all sort of election boards, they don't want to have to meet too often because it's a complete ball ache, you know, so the assumption is that it'll go to Bagoas. But then one of the old boys in the interview points out that Bagoas doesn't have a beard. I mean, he can't be a philosopher, he doesn't have a beard. And so Bagoas is famously supposed to have wittily answered that if a philosopher is to be judged on the length of his beard, then a billy goat should be elected as the new head of the peripatetic school. They don't necessarily record who got the job, but it's probably all a load of nonsense anyway. But it's an interesting story, and I think it tells quite an interesting narrative if you apply this into a historic context. So Shaving only really became popular in the ancient world with Alexander the Great, who, so sort of 4th century, um, he sort of begins the wonderful new age of shaving, which was a fairly groundbreaking concept up until then in sort of the Hellenistic and Roman world. Um, in the same way that we have President Kennedy to thank for the fact that men no longer wear hats. It's that sort of thing. The big boy in charge starts shaving off his beard, so everyone does it to be popular. Um, and the first barbers arrive in Rome. We have, according to Varro, who's a Roman writer, who writes on lots of quite can be quite interesting, can be quite boring things. He talks about beekeeping quite a lot and that sort of stuff. The first barbers arrive in Rome from Sicily in around 300 BC, and then the fad in Rome kicks off. Everyone's shaving off their beard. You don't want beards, they're horrible and they, full of grub and all that sort of disgusting stuff. So it's better to be clean shaven, to be a good, handsome, strong Roman. And this has become sort of the adopted thing in Rome. But as we know from the story that I told you earlier from Dio Cassius, that ain't the case in Athens, and they stick to their old aristocratic tradition of growing beards. And so for a long time, these sorts of things goes on. If you go to Athens, Romans will remark that all of the philosophers seem to be having beards, and this is the sort of time we've got this going on and that sort of stuff. And then later on, in about 155 BC, I say about, it is 155 BC, there's no about it, an embassy is sent from Athens to Rome, because I think the Athenians have done something a little bit naughty and they want to try and get the Romans on side. So they send, the ambassadors that are sent are 3 philosophers, and they are the head of the Platonic, the Aristotelian and the Stoic school. And they arrive in Rome and they've all got magnificent beards. And so this begins to become the stage where in the Roman conception of things, they start to associate philosophers in particular with beards. That becomes what philosophers have. To be a philosopher, you have to have a beard. In about, this continues, and then sort of in the next generation, 87 BC, Sulla attacks, besieges and captures Athens, and Athens becomes officially part of the Roman Empire. And Athens up until that point had been the cultural hub when it comes to philosophy. That had been the place where philosophy is, and that moves to Rome then after this happens. And it sort of gets dispersed around as well. The Stoics move to Rhodes and that sort of stuff, or one branch of it does. And this then becomes the point at which the philosophers in Rome start growing beards. So you could tell almost immediately if someone was a philosopher because you could see their big long beards. So that's just quite an interesting little thing. But interestingly, on a doctrine level, there's evidence as well that the condition in which your beard was kept could be a sign of what branch of philosophy you were. Now, there's a passage here that I'm going to read, which is from a letter by Alciphron. He'd been to a birthday party and he's writing a letter about it. And a group of philosophers were attending it. And he says, there was present amongst the foremost our friends Eteocles the Stoic, the oldster, with a beard that needed trimming, the dirty fellow, with head unkept, the aged sire, his brow more wrinkled than his leather purse. Present also was Themistogorus, of the Peripatetic school, a man whose appearance did not lack charm and who prided himself upon his curly whiskers. So it seems then that not only did your beard denote that you were a philosopher, but also that it denoted what philosophical approach you had. Now, the Stoic approach conceives of virtue being the most important thing to pursue in life, and you achieve that through the application of reason. And so the concern for your aesthetics and your outward appearance to the Stoics isn't that big. So they have they'll trim the beard to keep it sensible at a manageable length. But when it comes to that, there's no sort of vanity involved. Whereas the Peripatetic school of thought followed a more Aristotelian approach, which conceives of this notion that, yes, virtue is the important thing to follow. But also, going along with this, fate will intervene on occasion, and you're not going to, life gets in the way, and you're going to need something of benefit sometimes to be able to be virtuous. And as such, then, they will tend their beard a bit more carefully and keep it more well groomed. An interesting point. So, I wonder whether we should go back to that. Do you think? Might be useful. Different facial hair or hairstyles to distinguish what you did and why you are and what you believe. certainly something to think about, but philosophers' beards, not just something fun that can be knitted by your mum, although that indeed can be true. Beards. Let's all grow them, even the women. Come on, I just think if we all tried hard enough we could.